He was just a kid on a bike, and she was just an old lady with no one left. But that one simple ride home changed both of their lives forever. If this story moves you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell. We've got more powerful stories coming. Jalen wasn't doing anything special that afternoon. Just riding. The sun beat down hard, baking the cracked sidewalks of the neighborhood. His hands gripped the handlebars of his old red BMX, tires humming over the uneven pavement. He wore his usual hoodie half-zipped, one headphone in, one ear out, alert to the world. He didn't have a destination. Sometimes, riding was the only way to feel free. The only time the chaos of the world didn't feel like it was closing in. He passed the liquor store with the boarded-up windows, the corner bodega where Mr. Ruiz nodded from behind the bulletproof glass. The same beat-up sedan that never moved sat in front of 8th and Maple, with grass growing up around its tires. And then he saw her. An old white woman, standing at the bus stop with a large sun hat, a thin cane, and a plastic bag full of groceries. She looked like she didn't belong, not just because of her skin, but because of the way she stood, delicate, regal almost, like someone from a different world entirely. She flagged him down. He slowed, confused. "Excuse me, young man," she said, voice soft but firm. "Would you be willing to give me a ride? On the back of your bicycle, I mean." He blinked. "You serious?" She smiled gently. "As serious as I can be. The bus isn't coming, and I don't trust Uber. All those strangers." He looked around. "This ain't really the kind of place you should be walking alone. I figured that out 5 minutes after I arrived," she chuckled. "But I only need to get a few blocks up. My house is just off Alder Avenue." Jalen hesitated. This was weird. He didn't know her. She didn't know him. What if this was a trap? But something in her eyes, they were blue, faded like an old photograph, but kind. Not fake. Not judging him. He sighed and nodded at the small rear rack on his bike. "All right, but hold tight. This thing ain't exactly a limousine." She laughed, genuinely. "I used to ride with my husband on the back of a tandem bicycle. I think I can manage this." He pedaled slower than usual. People stared, some confused, some amused, some suspicious. An older black man on his porch muttered, "What the hell?" as Jalen rode past with the tiny white woman sitting primly behind him, holding her grocery bag with both hands. "You got a name?" he asked over his shoulder. "Florence," she said. "Florence Whitaker. I'm Jalen. Lovely to meet you, Jalen. You're very kind." He didn't say anything to that. They turned onto Alder Avenue. Big houses. Lawns that were actually green. A different world. "Number 918, she said, pointing with her cane. The house looked like something out of a movie. White columns, big wooden porch, wide windows with curtains drawn. There was even a mailbox shaped like a swan. He stopped by the front steps, kicking his foot down. Florence climbed off carefully, reaching into her purse. "Wait," he said. "You don't gotta pay me or nothing. It's fine." But she held out a crisp $20 bill. "For your time," she said. "And your kindness." He didn't want to take it. But his stomach growled, and he remembered he hadn't eaten all day. "All right," he said, slipping it into his pocket. "Come by sometime, if you're riding again," she said with a smile. "I don't get many visitors." He nodded once, then turned and rode off, not realizing he had just met the person who would change his life forever. It had been 2 days since Jalen gave the old lady a ride. He hadn't really thought about her much, or so he told himself. But every now and then, her voice echoed in his head. "I don't get many visitors." Something about the way she said it stuck with him. That afternoon, the sky was overcast. The air smelled like rain. He rode past Alder Avenue, thinking he'd just glance at the big White House again and move on. But when he reached the mailbox shaped like a swan, he found himself stopping. The porch light was on, even though it was still daylight. Curtains fluttered in the upstairs window. And on the porch, in the exact same spot he dropped her off, sat Florence Whitaker in a floral blouse, sipping tea. She saw him and smiled as if she'd been expecting him. "Well now," she said, rising slowly. "My night on 2 wheels returns." Jalen laughed awkwardly. "I was just riding past. Thought I'd check if you were okay." She motioned toward a porch chair. "Come sit. I've got lemonade if you prefer." He hesitated. "Sure, I guess." For a minute. Inside the house was like stepping into a time capsule. Mahogany furniture. Chandeliers. Framed oil paintings. No TV. No sound of electronics. Just the faint ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere in the back. "Dang," Jalen muttered. "This place is like a museum." Florence chuckled. "It's been in my family since the 1940s. My husband Charles kept everything in immaculate condition. Even after he passed, I just couldn't let it fall apart. They sat on the porch with glasses of cold lemonade. Jalen sipped cautiously. It was real, none of that powder mix stuff. Your husband, he said. You mentioned riding tandem bikes with him? She smiled softly, a distant look in her eyes. He was the love of my life. Kind, curious, a little clumsy. Always wore mismatched socks. Served in the Navy. When we met, I was just 19, working in a bookstore. He walked in asking for a copy of The Old Man and the Sea and ended up leaving with my heart. Jalen smiled despite himself. That's cute. She looked at him suddenly, closely. You remind me of him. He blinked. Me. Not in looks. Charles was as pale as a porcelain plate. But your eyes, the way you hesitate before speaking, that quiet thoughtfulness. He was like that too. Most people only notice noise. But kindness, real kindness, it shows in the silence. Jalen felt his ears go hot. No one had ever said something like that to him. People think I'm just quiet 'cause I don't got nothing to say. Well, they're wrong. They sat for nearly an hour, talking. Florence told him about her younger years. How she'd once been a pianist. How she used to sneak into jazz clubs in New Orleans when she was 22. How she'd never had kids, not by choice, but by biology. I always thought I'd be a mother, she said, looking out over the porch railing. But life had other plans. Jalen nodded. I never knew my dad. And my mom, she works a lot. So it's mostly just me. That quiet fell again. Not awkward, just full. Then Florence stood and said, Would you like to see something? He followed her inside, through the hall and into a study filled with books. On one wall, a giant oil painting. A man in a Navy uniform, holding a bike helmet, smiling. That's Charles. Jalen stepped closer. The resemblance and energy, not features, was uncanny. He always said, she continued, if I ever meet someone who reminds me of me, I'll know I've lived well. She looked at Jalen again, and for the first time, her voice cracked ever so slightly. I think he'd have liked you. Jalen didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. But something unspoken had passed between them. As he left, Florence handed him a small paper bag. For later, she said with a wink. Inside were 2 warm chocolate chip cookies wrapped in wax paper and a note. Come back whenever. The door's always open. Jalen rode home slower than usual that day. The wind felt different somehow. So did the world. The next week, Jalen came back. Then again 3 days later. And again after that. He wasn't even pretending to just ride by anymore. It became part of his routine. School, home, then 30 minutes with Florence Whitaker on her porch, drinking lemonade or cocoa, depending on the weather. He didn't tell anyone about it. Not his mom. Not his boys. This was his. On the 5th visit, Florence handed him a photo album. Take a look, she said. These are my favorite ghosts. Jalen sat beside her on the old swing bench, flipping through fading photos. Some black and white. Some color-worn. Florence as a young woman, hair curled, holding sheet music. Charles in uniform, grinning with a cigarette in hand. Her parents. A dog named Rupert. A garden full of tulips. Looks like a movie, Jalen said softly. That was life back then. Or at least, how we pretended it looked. She paused. I always imagined I'd be the kind of grandmother who spoiled her grandkids, who baked too many pies, who'd slip 20s into coat pockets when no one was looking. But that door never opened. Jalen stayed quiet. But when you showed up, she glanced sideways. You made me feel like I still had something to give. He looked up, uncomfortable but strangely touched. I'm not your grandson or anything. I know. But that doesn't stop my heart from pretending. Jalen turned the page. There was a photo of Charles with a young black boy. It looked old, maybe the 70s? That's Marcus, Florence said. Our neighbor's child. He used to mow our lawn, then sit on the porch and talk for hours. We loved him like our own. He went on to become a history teacher. Jalen smiled. Cool. You remind me of him too. Something in the way you listen. He swallowed. Most people don't like when I talk. Most people don't know how to listen. Later that day, when Jalen stood to leave, Florence did something new. She reached out and gently squeezed his hand. You're welcome here anytime, dear. You bring a warmth this house hasn't had in decades. He nodded once, eyes a little wetter than before, and rode home. That night, his mom asked where he'd been. Just riding, he said. She glanced up from her paperwork. You always come back happier lately. Something going on. He hesitated. There's this old lady. I help her out sometimes. That's all. His mom raised a brow, but didn't pry. Just be careful, baby. Not everyone's what they seem. I know, he said. But something told him Florence was exactly who she seemed to be. The next visit, Florence had baked peach cobbler. They ate it with forks right out of the dish, laughing like it was the most natural thing in the world. I haven't laughed like this in years, she said. You'd think I'd forgotten how. Same, he muttered, and they looked at each other for a long moment. Two people from different planets, a rich white woman who lived through wars and presidents, and a quiet black kid from a cracked neighborhood where sirens were louder than birds. But somehow, here on this porch, they weren't so different after all. One day, after weeks of visits, Florence brought out a dusty cardboard box. Inside were books. Dozens of them. Hardcovers, old and well-kept. These were Charles's favorites, she said. History, strategy, philosophy. He always believed knowledge was armor. Jalen ran his fingers over the titles. Would you like to borrow them? He blinked. Me. Of course. You've got the mind for it. I can tell. No one had ever said that to him before. Not a teacher. Not his mom. Not even himself. He picked one, Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. And when he rode home that day, it sat in his backpack like something sacred. What neither of them knew yet was that the days of sitting and laughing on the porch were running short. Something was coming. Something neither of them could stop. But for now, they had this moment. And it was more than enough. The weather turned colder. October settled in like a faded coat, soft, but heavy. The leaves on Alder Avenue drifted onto manicured lawns like golden confetti. Halloween decorations appeared, but the Whitaker porch stayed the same. No cobwebs, no fake ghosts. Just real memories and quiet talks. Jalen was there 3, sometimes 4 times a week now. Sometimes they talked about books. Sometimes about Florence's late husband. And sometimes they just sat and said nothing at all. But outside the fence, people were watching. It happened on a Tuesday. Jalen had just arrived, locking his bike to the front rail, when a police cruiser rolled up slow. 2 officers stepped out. One tapped his flashlight against his palm. The other adjusted his belt. Hey there, son, the first one said. You live here. Jalen froze. Florence wasn't on the porch yet. He stood on her front steps, hard hammering. No, sir. I'm visiting. Visiting? Huh? The second one looked him up and down. Got ID. Jalen fumbled in his hoodie, pulling out his school ID card. One of the officers snatched it, looked, and raised a brow. 16, huh? You're a little far from your side of town. Jalen felt his throat tighten. I come here a lot. The lady who lives here, Florence Whitaker, she's my friend. The first cop smirked. Your friend? Huh? Lady in her 80s. Then the door opened. Florence stepped out, cane in hand, voice sharp as ice. Officers, she said. What seems to be the problem? They turned. The smirk fell off their faces instantly. We got a call, ma'am. Neighbor said there was a young man loitering on your porch. Just wanted to check it out. Florence's jaw tightened. This young man is my guest. And if you're finished harassing children based on the color of their skin, you can kindly get off my property. The taller officer shifted uncomfortably. No disrespect, ma'am. We're just doing our job. No, she snapped. You're doing your version of it. Now leave. And next time someone makes a false report, maybe ask them why they're uncomfortable seeing kindness. They left. Eventually. But Jalen stood still, skin hot with shame, rage, and something else. Inside, he sat in silence. Florence poured tea with trembling hands. I'm so sorry, Jalen, she said quietly. It ain't your fault. Oh, but it is, she whispered. This world made me the exception. It makes into a target. He looked away. I'm used to it. You shouldn't be. That night, Jalen didn't tell his mom. He didn't tell anyone. But the next day, Florence called a locksmith. The day after that, she had cameras installed. The week after, a legal document was drawn up, granting Jalen visitation and protection rights on her property. I don't want anyone having an excuse to question your place here, she said. He stared at the papers. You didn't have to do this. She smiled gently. But I wanted to. Sometimes family isn't who you're born to. It's who fights for you when no one else will. Jalen didn't cry. Not really. But when he hugged her, he held on longer than usual. Outside the tall white fences of Alder Avenue, the whispers continued. Who is that boy? Why is he always there? Some neighbors turned their heads. Others locked their doors. But Jalen didn't stop coming. Because inside that old house, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Home. The next time Jalen came by, he found Florence sitting in the study, staring at an old calendar pinned to the wall. Everything okay? He asked, stepping inside. She didn't look up. Today would have been Charles's birthday, she said softly. We used to spend it dancing in the living room, drinking cheap champagne. Jalen sat beside her. That sounds nice. She chuckled faintly. It was. He'd always say, let's pretend we're 25 again, even when his knees couldn't handle it. There was a pause. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, my birthday's next week. But no one's remembered it in years. Jalen blinked. What day? Thursday. The 12th. He made a mental note. She waved her hand. It's nothing. Just another day on the calendar. But he saw it, the way her fingers clutched her shawl just a little tighter. The way she stared past him, like waiting for someone who never came. That night, Jalen sat in his room, staring at a crumpled paper bag on his desk. Inside, crumpled bills, change, a few coins he'd tucked away for sneakers. He sighed. The sneakers could wait. On the morning of the 12th, Florence heard a knock. When she opened the door, she gasped. There stood Jalen, holding a lopsided chocolate cake with plastic candles stuck in it. A pink balloon floated behind him, tied to the handlebar of his bike. Happy birthday, he said, grinning. Florence put a trembling hand to her mouth. You remembered. He nodded. I made the cake myself. Kinda. I got help from Miss Carla at the community center. She laughed, actual tears in her eyes. Get in here before the balloon floats away. The living room turned into a tiny party. They ate cake on paper plates. Jalen played an old Ella Fitzgerald song on his phone. Florence stood slowly and took his hand. Let me show you how Charles used to do it. He let her lead. Her feet barely moved, but her eyes sparkled. For 2 minutes, under the flicker of the chandelier, they danced. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't planned. But it was real. Afterward, Florence sat down and whispered, no one's ever done something like that for me. Not in years. Jalen shrugged. You do a lot for me too. She touched his hand gently. You have no idea what this means to me. And maybe he didn't. Maybe he couldn't. But that moment, the cake, the music, the balloon tied to the bike, became a memory neither of them would ever forget. Later, as Jalen left, she handed him a small box. I was saving this for someday, she said. Now feels right. Inside was a silver pocket watch. Charles's initials engraved on the back. He'd want you to have it. Jalen stared at it, speechless. I can't. You can. And you will. And that night, as the streetlights flickered on and the leaves fell in golden showers, Jalen rode home with the watch in his pocket and a warmth in his chest that no hoodie could hide. A few days after her birthday, Florence made a call. Her voice was calm, steady, businesslike. But beneath the surface, something stirred. Henry, she said to the man on the other end, I need you to come by the house. It's time. Henry Parrish had been her lawyer for over 30 years. He arrived on a foggy afternoon in a black coat and a worn leather briefcase. Florence welcomed him with tea and a firm handshake. You finally made up your mind? He asked gently, opening his notebook. She nodded. I don't want the state deciding what happens when I'm gone. I'm making my own decisions. While I still can. Henry glanced toward the window. Outside, Jalen was tossing a ball for the neighbor's dog, laughing. You sure? He asked. Florence's answer was instant. As sure as I've ever been about anything. Later that evening, Jalen came inside to find Florence at the kitchen table, sorting through old papers. Everything okay? She smiled. Just estate stuff. He furrowed his brow. Like a will. Exactly. He sat down slowly. You're not sick, are you? She shook her head. No. But life doesn't wait for permission. And I'd rather be prepared. He looked uneasy. I don't like thinking about that. I know. But that's because you still have so much of your life ahead. I've lived most of mine. There was silence for a moment. Then she said softly, Jalen, I want you to know something. He turned to her. I've spoken to my lawyer. I'm naming you the sole beneficiary of my estate. He blinked. What does that mean? It means when I pass, everything I own, this house, the land, my savings, will be yours. The room fell still. Jalen stared at her, not comprehending. Why me? She looked at him like it was the simplest thing in the world. Because you've given me something no one else has. A reason to smile again. You treat me like I matter. You've reminded me what it feels like to be loved. He shook his head, overwhelmed. But you barely know me. I'm just... You're not just anything, she said. You're kind. You're thoughtful. You show up. That's more than most people do. Tears burned in his eyes. I don't deserve all that. Maybe not yet, she said gently. But someday you will. And I'd rather leave my life's work in the hands of someone who might do good than someone who's already forgotten what good is. That night, Jalen rode home slower than usual. He kept replaying her words in his head. He thought about what she saw in him. And for the first time in his life, he wondered if maybe it was true. Maybe he could be something more. Not just a kid from the block. Not just a name on a school roll. Not just someone passing by. But someone who mattered. The change started quietly. First, it was the mail, letters arriving in thick envelopes with law firm logos and unfamiliar names. Then, phone calls that Florence let ring unanswered. And then, one Friday afternoon, a stranger came knocking. He was in his late 40s, tall, with the kind of polished arrogance that came from wearing expensive suits too often. His name was Gregory Whitaker. Cousin, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Well, technically second cousin once removed. But family, nonetheless. Florence didn't smile back. You haven't spoken to me in 20 years. Gregory shrugged. Life gets busy. But I heard about your situation. The boy. Florence's expression hardened. His name is Jalen. Gregory chuckled. Right. Jalen. From the neighborhood, yes? Interesting choice for an heir. She narrowed her eyes. Cut to the point, Gregory. He leaned against her doorframe, casually aggressive. I've already spoken to Henry. He says it's your right to leave your estate to whomever you choose. But let's be honest, a teenager? A stranger? Someone who'll sell the house the second you're gone. He's not a stranger. And he's more family to me than you've ever been. Gregory's face twitched. Don't be naive. You think he cares about you? He's just being sweet to get what he wants. Florence's voice turned to steel. Be very careful what you say next. Gregory stepped back, raising his hands. I'm just saying, people talk. You might want to think about how this looks. To the neighbors. To the community. To the courts, if it comes to that. He left with the same fake smile. But the air he left behind felt colder. Jalen arrived an hour later to find Florence quiet, her tea untouched. You okay? He asked. She nodded slowly. Just tired. Old ghost knocking. He didn't press. But as he sat beside her, she slipped her hand over his and squeezed. No matter what you hear, no matter what anyone says, I trust you. You understand. He looked into her eyes and saw something he hadn't seen before. Not fear, but defiance. I understand. That weekend, someone slashed the tires on Jalen's bike. On Monday, a cop car cruised slowly past his house twice. On Wednesday, one of Florence's neighbors muttered loud enough for him to hear, not sure what she's thinking, bringing that boy into her will. Jalen didn't say a word, but inside, something heavy started building. He thought about giving it up, telling Florence that maybe it was better if he stopped visiting. Maybe it was too much trouble. But then he remembered the look in her eyes that night on the porch, the way her voice broke when she said, You treat me like I matter. He wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. The sky over Alder Avenue turned gray, not from weather, but from mood, like the neighborhood itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Florence felt it too. She sat at her desk, pen poised over a stack of legal forms, her hand trembling slightly. Are you sure about this? Henry Parrish asked from across the room. She looked up, firm. More sure than I've been about anything in a long time. Henry nodded and opened his briefcase. I filed the preliminary documents already. But once this is notarized and finalized, there's no turning back. Good. Florence signed her name slowly, each letter steady. By the time she set the pen down, it was done. That afternoon, Jalen arrived with groceries. Got that sweet bread you like, he said, holding up the bag with a grin. Florence smiled faintly but didn't rise from her chair. You ever feel like people are watching you, even when you're alone? She asked. He hesitated. Yeah, a lot, actually. She exhaled. I think the house is being watched. Jalen sat across from her, suddenly tense. By who? Gregory's pushing something. I overheard a call. He's trying to get a judge to question my mental capacity. Jalen's jaw tightened. He wants to say you're crazy? She nodded. If a court agrees, everything I signed could be undone. He stood abruptly. That's insane. You're the sharpest person I know. But that doesn't matter to people like him, she said quietly. To them, I'm just an old woman with money and a soft spot for a boy who doesn't belong here. Jalen looked at the floor. A storm swirled in his chest. He wanted to do something, scream, fight, punch a wall. But he also knew that if he got angry, they'd call him dangerous. He sat back down and asked, What do you need me to do? She reached out and took his hand. Be patient. Be strong. And most of all, don't let them scare you away. The next week, someone called Child Protective Services on Jalen's family. An anonymous report claimed his mother wasn't providing a stable home. It was a lie, but it brought social workers to their door. His mother, exhausted from double shifts, almost cried in front of them. Jalen knew exactly who was behind it. Gregory. Or someone hired by him. It was getting worse. At school, Jalen noticed kids whispering. Someone had posted a photo of him with Florence, captioned with a $sign. Gold digger, someone muttered in the hallway. He slammed his locker shut and walked away. That Friday, he biked to Florence's house through cold wind. He was shaking when he got there, from anger, not cold. But when she opened the door, she was smiling. Calm. Centered. They can throw their stones, she said as he stepped inside. But I've built stronger walls. She handed him a sealed envelope. Keep this somewhere safe. It's a copy of the will, with my full medical evaluations attached. They can try to say I've lost my mind, but the evidence says otherwise. Jalen took the envelope like it was glass. I'll protect it, he said. She leaned forward and kissed his forehead. I know. The lights outside the Whitaker house glowed warm against the evening mist. Inside, two souls, one young, one old, stood shoulder to shoulder, unafraid. Because even when the world whispered, they had each other. The court date came faster than anyone expected. Florence, dressed in dark navy, sat beside Henry Parrish at the long wooden table. Her posture was regal, her gaze direct. Across the aisle, Gregory sat smugly with a team of expensive-looking attorneys. The room was sterile, quiet, except for the soft ticking of the court's wall clock. Jalen sat in the back row, his knee bouncing. He hated this place, the coldness, the labels, the power games. But most of all, he hated how people like Gregory could make truth seem suspicious just by smiling the right way. Your Honor, Gregory's lawyer began. Our concern lies with Ms. Whitaker's mental capacity. It is not about greed. It is about protecting a vulnerable elderly woman from manipulation by someone who, by all accounts, has only been in her life for a few months. Florence's lips curled into a small smile. Henry stood. We have psychiatric evaluations from 2 independent doctors, both attesting to Ms. Whitaker's full cognitive function. And we have a decade of medical history with no mention of decline. This is not about her mind. This is about his motives. Gregory's lawyer raised a brow. And do we have any proof of his integrity? Florence didn't wait for her lawyer this time. I'll speak. The courtroom paused. The judge nodded. Florence stood, gripping her cane. I've lived in that house for 47 years. I've known men like Gregory even longer. They come around when the gold shines. They vanish when you bleed. She pointed toward Jalen. That boy? He showed up when I had nothing. He didn't know I was rich. He thought I was just some old lady on a bench. Soft murmurs rippled. He talked to me. He walked me home. He brought me cake on my birthday. And he listened. Do you know how rare that is at my age? For someone to listen. Gregory shifted uncomfortably. He reminded me of the man I married. Kind, humble, brave. And if you think I don't have the clarity of mind to choose who inherits my home, my land, and my stories, then you need a psychiatrist. Later, they called Jalen to the stand. His palms were sweating as he raised his hand and swore to tell the truth. Jalen, the opposing lawyer asked, when did you first realize Florence was wealthy? He frowned. I didn't. Not at first. She was just this lady who looked lonely. Lonely? The man repeated, as if mocking. Yeah. Like nobody had talked to her in a while. Like she was invisible. A pause. And you started visiting her often. Helping her. Why? Jalen hesitated, then looked at Florence. Because I liked her. Because she treated me like a person. She didn't judge me. She remembered my name. She made me feel like I mattered. The room was still. And you're telling us that had nothing to do with inheritance? No, Jalen said firmly. That came later. And I told her not to. I said it felt wrong. But she wouldn't listen. He laughed softly, a sad smile flickering. She said people like me never get chosen. So she was going to choose me, just to prove that someone could. The judge looked at him longer than necessary, then nodded slowly. When court recessed for lunch, Florence leaned close to Jalen. You did good. I was terrified. You didn't show it. That's what counts. Back in the hallway, Gregory passed by them. He leaned in. This isn't over. Florence smiled sweetly. Oh, honey. It is. You just don't know it yet. The judge's decision came 3 days later. It was read aloud in a quiet courtroom. The will was valid. The challenge was denied. Florence Whitaker's estate would be inherited by Jalen Morris. Gregory stormed out without a word. Florence remained seated, her expression unreadable. Henry leaned over and whispered, It's done. Florence just nodded and whispered back, It began long before this. The weeks after the ruling felt strangely quiet. The neighborhood eventually stopped whispering. The stares faded. Florence returned to her front porch. Jalen returned to his weekend visits. They talked about everything and nothing. Sometimes they said only a few words. Sometimes they laughed for hours. But one morning, Jalen showed up and found the front door already unlocked. The air inside felt different. He walked slowly, calling her name. She was in her favorite chair, near the window, covered with a soft quilt. Her hands were folded neatly, her eyes closed, and on her face, a small, peaceful smile. A note rested on the armrest. Jalen, don't cry long. Laugh a little louder for me. Take care of the garden. Read the blue book on the shelf. And remember, not all angels have wings. Love. Florence. The funeral was small. By her request, no open casket, no fanfare, just sunflowers, old jazz records, and a spot near the back of the garden where she used to sit and talk to the squirrels. Jalen spoke. He was nervous. His voice cracked. But when he said, "She saw me before I saw myself," there wasn't a dry eye in the yard. Months passed. Jalen still lived with his mom, but he came to the house every day. He cleaned, fixed up the porch, learned how to cook some of her old recipes. And every Sunday afternoon, he sat on that bench. The one by the corner store. The one where she first asked for a ride home. And sometimes, he'd sit in silence. Other times, he'd talk to no one in particular. But often, someone would sit beside him. A tired woman. A lonely man. A teenager with nowhere to go. And Jalen would smile and say, "Hi, I'm Jalen. You okay?" In time, people stopped calling it Ms. Whitaker's house. They started calling it the house on the hill. The one where the porch light was always on. The one where someone always listened. The one where kindness didn't ask your name first. And in a drawer, beneath that soft quilt, was a small frame with a photo. Florence. Jalen. 2 cups of tea. 1 crooked smile. And beneath it, scribbled in her handwriting, "Chosen family is still family."